Chapter 1. Before Georgia was Georgia. Long before Georgia appeared on any map, before the word Georgia was ever uttered by European tongues, the land teemed with life, purpose, and ancient rhythm. Towering pine forests whispered in the wind, wide rivers coursed like veins through rolling hills, and 1,000 stories were told by the smoke that rose from earthen lodges and the footprints that traced ancient trails through the dense southern wilds. This was not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was already home to civilizations that thrived, traded, farmed, and fought for centuries before the first sails crested the Atlantic horizon. To understand the true beginning of Georgia, one must step into a world that predates the colony, the state, and even the idea of the United States. Around 1000 A.D., the Mississippian culture arose across the southeast, stretching its influence across the river valleys of what we now call the American South. In Georgia, one of its most striking footprints still stands: the great mounds of Etowah. Etowah wasn't merely a village or a ceremonial site. It was a city, a capital of its time, organized and engineered with startling sophistication. Here, near the banks of the Etowah River, massive earthen mounds rose toward the sky, their flat tops once crowned with temples, council houses, and the homes of the elite. These mounds were not randomly placed. They were aligned with the movements of the sun and stars, proof of an advanced understanding of astronomy and timekeeping. Beneath the mounds, archaeologists have unearthed a rich tapestry of artifacts: copper breastplates etched with sacred birds, shell gorgets with swirling motifs, finely crafted effigies, and buried warriors whose weapons told of both protection and conquest. Surrounding the mounds, thousands of people lived in wattle and daub homes, cultivating maize in raised garden plots and fishing the rivers with nets woven from native plants. Their fields were geometric marvels, planned for efficiency, yielding corn, squash, beans, and sunflowers, the so-called three sisters of native agriculture, plus additional crops uniquely adapted to the warm, fertile land. Their society was hierarchical, with powerful chiefs at the top, surrounded by advisors, warriors, artisans, and farmers. Ritual and politics were deeply entwined. The elite, it seems, claimed a sacred connection to the cosmos, reinforcing their rule through ceremonial cycles and public displays of power atop the mounds. But the Mississippian world was not limited to Etowah. Trade networks stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Whelk shells from the coast, copper from the north, and obsidian from the west passed through Georgia's lands, changing hands in ceremonies, marriages, and diplomatic alliances. The rivers were the lifeblood of this exchange, and the Chattahoochee, Ocmulgee, Altamaha, and Savannah rivers became highways of culture, commerce, and migration. By the 1500s, when Spanish explorers began poking into the interior, the Mississippian way of life had begun to wane, though its echoes lingered. A changing climate, internal strife, and the eventual pressure of European diseases contributed to the unraveling of this mound-building civilization. But its descendants endured. Out of the ashes of Mississippian power rose the Creek-Muskogee Confederacy, a loose alliance of towns and tribal communities known as Talwas. These towns, often semi-autonomous, were scattered throughout what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. Each had its own leaders, traditions, and dialects, yet they shared a cultural core. The Creek people spoke a Muskogean language, and their identity was rooted in the balance between individuality and unity. Creek life centered on the town square, usually marked by a sacred fire and surrounded by a rectangular plaza. Here, councils met, Rituals unfolded, and ball games erupted in fierce but ceremonial rivalry. Warfare was common, but so were peace councils. The Creeks were diplomats, traders, and warriors. Their laws, passed by consensus, emphasized restitution and balance over retribution. Their world was matrilineal. Children belonged to their mother's clan, and women held key roles in the spiritual and social life of the town. While men hunted, built, and fought, women managed the crops, raised the children, and maintained the continuity of traditions. Gender roles were distinct but deeply respected, and the harmony between masculine and feminine energy was reflected in their stories, ceremonies, and seasonal dances. To the north and west, in the Appalachian foothills and mountain valleys, the Cherokee people established a different yet equally complex society. They too were descendants of Mississippian cultures, but evolved in relative isolation, developing their own language, an Iroquoian tongue, and distinct cultural forms. The Cherokee towns, known as townhouses, were usually built around rivers, with council houses sitting on elevated platforms. Cherokee society emphasized consensus and clan. Like the Creeks, they traced descent through the mother. Their government consisted of a council of elders, and decisions were made not with haste, but with patience, deliberation, and deep respect for the voices of all. The Cherokees had a mythic understanding of their world. The mountains were sacred, the rivers living, and the animals carried wisdom. Their oral traditions carried the memory of ancient migrations, the creation of the world, and the duties of humans as caretakers of the earth. Stories were not entertainment alone. They were moral compasses, historical records, and spiritual instruction. When Hernando de Soto's expedition thundered through the region in 1540, it marked a turning point that would forever alter these civilizations. De Soto came with armor, horses, and steel, but also with diseases against which the native peoples had no defense. The chaos that followed his incursion rippled for generations. Towns emptied by plague were overtaken by rivals. Political alliances frayed. The old trade routes turned dangerous. Yet despite the losses, native life in Georgia did not vanish. It transformed. By the 1600s and 1700s, the Creek Confederacy had reorganized itself, forming stronger political alliances to deal with European powers. They played the British, French, and Spanish against each other, offering trade goods and diplomatic favors in exchange for weapons, cloth, and political leverage. The Cherokee, too, adapted. Some took to English dress, converted to Christianity, and sent their children to mission schools. Still, beneath the surface of diplomacy lay a deep and growing tension. Land was at the center of everything. The rivers, the forests, the sacred sites. These were not abstract territories. They were identities, ancestral obligations, spirits incarnate. As European settlers pushed further inward, cutting down trees, fencing land, and building roads, they didn't just take territory. They disrupted entire cosmologies. And yet the memory of what came before persisted. Even today, the names echo through the landscape. Chattahoochee, Ocmulgee, Tallapoosa, Etowah. These are not relics of colonial naming. They are remnants of a deeper time, when the land was alive with songlines, trail markers, and sacred fire smoke curling into dawn skies. The story of Georgia cannot begin with James Oglethorpe or Savannah. It must begin here, in the ancient paths carved by deer and followed by generations of native people. In the soil where corn once grew in concentric rings. In the rivers where trade canoes slipped through cypress shadows. in the mounds where chiefs watched the heavens and the people gathered to honor the turning of the year. Before Georgia had a name, it had a soul, and that soul was shaped by the hands and hearts of those who lived here for thousands of years, whose stories were carried not in books, but in breath, in drumbeats, and in the enduring shape of the land itself. Chapter 2. The Spanish and the British Claim the South. When the first whispers of European footsteps reached the sandy shores of what would become Georgia, the world was already in the throes of transformation. Across the Atlantic, empires were rising and falling. Maps were being redrawn with each voyage. And the south of North America became a chessboard upon which kings and conquistadors would move their pieces. Georgia, still unnamed and untamed, stood in the crosshairs of this great contest. The Spanish came first, with their dreams of gold and glory, followed by the British, who imagined not treasure, but a carefully engineered society, a colony born of reform, defense, and lofty ideals. Between these competing visions, the land itself became both stage and prize, setting the foundation for centuries of struggle and reinvention. The Spanish had already carved their empire through Mexico, Peru, and Florida by the time their eyes turned northward. In 1540, Hernando de Soto's expedition cut through the dense forests and rolling hills of the southeast. His men, armored and weary, clashed with native peoples who had thrived in these lands for generations. The Spanish were not greeted as saviors, nor as guests, but as dangerous intruders, and the scars of those encounters left long memories among the native tribes. De Soto himself never found the fabled cities of gold he sought, dying in 1542. His body weighted and cast into the Mississippi River. Yet the impression he left behind of Europeans wielding steel, horses, and diseases unseen before forever altered the destiny of the South. Later Spanish missions would dot the coast, especially around St. Augustine in Florida and stretching up toward the Guale, people's lands along the Georgia coast. Missionaries came with a cross instead of a sword, but their presence still carried the ambition of empire. For decades, Spanish friars sought to convert native communities, teaching them prayers, reshaping their rituals, and trying to bind them to the Spanish crown as loyal subjects. Yet the frontier proved stubborn, and Spain's grip in the north never matched its strength in Mexico or the Caribbean. Raids, rebellions, and rival European incursions thinned the fragile outposts. By the 1700s, the Spanish stronghold north of Florida was more memory than fact, leaving a vacuum soon filled by another power eager to stake its claim. That power was Britain, ascendant across the globe and hungry for new footholds. To the British crown, the area south of the Carolinas represented both opportunity and danger. Opportunity because fertile land stretched wide, rich with potential crops that could fuel the empire's growing markets. Danger because Spain still lingered nearby in Florida, and hostile tribes could ally with European rivals. To leave the territory unsettled was to leave Britain's southern flank vulnerable. Yet there was also another motivation, one rooted not in military strategy, but in a social experiment. By the early 1700s, London was overflowing with debtors' prisons. Men and women who could not pay their dues languished behind bars, not for violent crimes, but for the simple crime of poverty. The idea began to take root among reformers that perhaps these unfortunates could be given a new life across the ocean. There, far from the grime of London's alleys, they might become farmers, soldiers, and loyal colonists. Out of this dream emerged the vision of Georgia, a colony not built on conquest or greed alone, but on ideals of renewal, defense, and Enlightenment order. Into this moment stepped General James Oglethorpe, a man whose name would forever be tied to Georgia's beginnings. A soldier, parliamentarian, and philanthropist, Oglethorpe had been moved by the plight of debtors rotting in English prisons. His own friend had died in such confinement, and that tragedy became fuel for his cause. Along with a group of trustees, Oglethorpe petitioned King George II for a charter to found a new colony. In 1732, the king granted it, naming the land Georgia in his honor. The charter laid out ambitious goals. The colony would provide a fresh start for England's poor, act as a defensive buffer against Spanish Florida, and grow silk and other crops that could enrich the empire. In one stroke, philanthropy, strategy, and economics intertwined, creating a colony unlike any other in British America. When Oglethorpe sailed with the first settlers aboard the ship Anne in 1733, they carried not only supplies, but also a blueprint for society. Unlike Virginia, born in tobacco and slavery, or the Carolinas, carved out by wealthy planters, Georgia would begin with strict rules. Slavery was initially banned, as was rum, in hopes of preventing vice and exploitation. Land grants were capped to discourage the rise of sprawling estates. The trustees imagined a land of sturdy yeoman farmers, sober and industrious, defending the frontier with plows in one hand and muskets in the other. It was a utopian dream, fragile but daring, and at its center stood Oglethorpe, guiding his settlers into a wilderness that had witnessed centuries of native life, decades of Spanish missions, and now the dawn of a new British experiment. The site chosen for the colony's first settlement was a bluff overlooking the Savannah River, a place already valued by the Yamacraw, a band of Creek Indians led by Chief Tomochichi. Unlike so many encounters between Europeans and natives, this one began not in blood, but in negotiation. Tomochichi saw in Oglethorpe a potential ally against rival tribes and against the lingering shadow of the Spanish. Oglethorpe, for his part, recognized that survival depended on peace. Through the mediation of Mary Musgrove, a woman of mixed Creek and English heritage, the two leaders forged an alliance. It was a fragile friendship, but a foundational one, allowing Savannah to be built without the immediate devastation that had greeted other colonial ventures. In this fragile peace lay a paradox. The very land on which the colony thrived was land the natives ceded, willingly or not, in a world that was closing in on them from all sides. Savannah itself rose not haphazardly, but with the precision of Enlightenment ideals. Oglethorpe envisioned not the crooked streets of London, but a rational, ordered city. Squares were laid out in a grid, each surrounded by blocks for homes, businesses, and churches. Wide streets allowed air to flow, trees were planted for shade, and communal spaces fostered unity. The plan, still visible today in Savannah's historic district, reflected the Enlightenment belief that human reason could shape even the wilderness into order and beauty. Settlers built homes of wood and brick, while public buildings took shape around the central squares. Life was difficult. Disease, heat, and scarcity tested the colonists. But the city's very design gave it resilience. It became not just a place to live, but a symbol of the colony's lofty ideals. Yet ideals often bend under pressure. The prohibition on slavery, noble as it seemed, clashed with economic realities. Rice and indigo thrived in the South, but they demanded backbreaking labor. Neighboring colonies enriched themselves on the backs of enslaved Africans, and Georgia's settlers soon grew restless under restrictions. The ban on rum, too, proved unpopular, and smuggling became common. Oglethorpe resisted, clinging to the vision of a disciplined, egalitarian society. But the tide of demand swelled. By the 1750s, the bans were lifted, and Georgia began to resemble its neighbors more than its founders had ever intended. Plantations spread, slavery took root, and the colony's original experiment gave way to the familiar patterns of wealth and inequality that marked the South. What began as a social reform became, in time, another cog in the machinery of empire. Still, Oglethorpe's role cannot be understated. He defended the colony not only with law and planning, but with arms. In 1742, during the War of Jenkins' Ear, Spanish forces launched an attack on Georgia, seeking to reclaim territory they still claimed. Oglethorpe led the defense at the Battle of Bloody Marsh on St. Simon's Island, where his men repelled the Spanish and secured Georgia's place as a British colony. It was a decisive moment, proving that Georgia could hold its own and serve the very purpose for which it was founded, a buffer between empires. Afterward, Oglethorpe returned to England, leaving behind a colony that bore his imprint in every square of Savannah and every law of its charter. As the decades passed, Georgia grew in population and wealth, shaped by the same forces that defined the broader South: the lure of land, the expansion of slavery, and the constant tension with native tribes. The ideals of its founding still lingered in memory, but reality had hardened them into something more pragmatic. The colony was no longer an experiment, but a participant in the Atlantic world of trade, plantations, and imperial rivalry. Ships came and went from Savannah's port, carrying rice, indigo, and eventually cotton, linking Georgia to markets in Europe and the Caribbean. Wealthy planters emerged, their estates worked by enslaved Africans, while poor farmers carved out more modest existences inland. The colony society stratified, its utopian ambitions fading into the background as the economic engine of slavery ground forward. Yet even as Georgia became more like its neighbors, its origins gave it a character distinct from the rest. It was the youngest of the 13 colonies, the last to be founded, and that youth carried with it both advantages and burdens. Younger meant less entrenched, more malleable, and perhaps more hesitant to break from the empire that had created it. But younger also meant hungrier, ambitious, and eager to prove itself in the company of older, prouder colonies. This duality would matter when the storm of revolution broke across America, testing Georgia's loyalties and forcing it to choose between crown and independence. But that chapter lay ahead. For now, in the mid-17th century, Georgia had survived its infancy, transformed from Spanish mission frontier to British Enlightenment colony, and taken its place in the family of English America. The story of Georgia's colonial birth is not one of simple conquest or simple charity. It is a story of contradictions, of Spanish priests and British generals, of noble ideals and harsh realities, of alliances that bridged cultures even as they foretold dispossession. It is the story of a city, Savannah, that still stands as a testament to vision, resilience, and the power of design. And it is the story of how a land once walked by conquistadors became a British colony, preparing unknowingly for the next great upheaval. For revolution was on the horizon, and Georgia, though young, would soon be called upon to take a side, to bleed, and to define itself not as a colony, but as a state in a new nation. Chapter 3: Georgia in the American Revolution. Georgia, the last born of the 13 colonies, came into the world not with the rebellious fire of its northern siblings, but with caution in its heart and a complicated identity stitched into its soil. It was younger, smaller, and more dependent than the rest. While Massachusetts was protesting taxes and Virginia was forming committees of correspondence, Georgia was still busy carving out its frontier, entangled in British aid, Creek diplomacy, and the shadow of Spanish Florida. Loyalty to the crown wasn't just politics in Georgia. It was survival. In 1775, as the winds of revolution began to howl, Georgia hesitated. Its royal governor, James Wright, was a man of calm authority, a Southerner himself who had managed to keep relative peace in the colony. Many of Georgia's elites, rice planters, merchants, and frontier settlers, benefited from their ties to London. They feared losing more than they hoped to gain. Rebellion, to them, smelled not of freedom, but of economic ruin and foreign invasion. But even in cautious lands, revolution has a way of lighting sparks in hidden corners. It began with whispers, then meetings. Patriots in Savannah formed a provincial congress in January 1775, but it was sparsely attended and deeply divided. Georgia was the only colony not to send a representative to the First Continental Congress. But events were moving too quickly for silence to be sustained. By July of that same year, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the revolutionary fever grew hotter. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army, the colonists across the South began to realize this was no longer a local protest. It was a national cause. By early 1776, even Georgia had joined the Second Continental Congress. The hesitation was over. The die was cast. Georgia was in the war. The fight came quickly and with fury. Savannah, the colonial capital, was the first major target. In December 1778, British troops stormed the city in a surprise amphibious assault. Georgia, poorly defended and lacking in militia organization, could not hold the line. Savannah fell swiftly, and with it, the British began their southern strategy, a plan to conquer the southern colonies from the bottom up, using loyalist support and enslaved Africans promised freedom for fighting against their masters. Governor James Wright returned to rule under British authority, while patriots fled or formed resistance groups in the hinterlands. Georgia, now the only colony completely under British control, seemed like a lost cause. But the story was far from over. In the backwoods, on the edge of settled lands, rebellion burned hotter than ever. Here, among the pine forests and river valleys, militia leaders rose not from aristocratic halls, but from humble farms and hard lives. Men like Elijah Clark, a rugged frontiersman from Wilkes County, took up arms not for theoretical liberty, but because they knew what tyranny felt like when it wore a red coat and burned your neighbor's crops. Clark led a ragtag force of backcountry soldiers in guerrilla warfare, striking at British outposts and loyalist militias. His most famous stand came at the Battle of Kettle Creek in February 1779. It was a cold morning when his men ambushed a force of loyalists marching to join British forces in Augusta. Outnumbered and outgunned, Clark's men used the element of surprise and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to break the Loyalist line. It was more than a skirmish. It was a turning point. The Patriot victory at Kettle Creek disrupted British plans and breathed new life into Georgia's resistance. Far from the battlefield, other forms of resistance took root. In the woods near Elbert County, a woman named Nancy Hart carved her name into the legend of American defiance. Tall, red-haired, and fiercely patriotic, Hart lived with her husband and children in a cabin near the Broad River. She was no soldier, but her contributions were no less critical. According to stories passed down through generations, Nancy Hart spied on British troops, disguising herself as a man to gather information. She was said to have captured and shot British soldiers who tried to invade her home, holding them at gunpoint until help arrived. Whether every detail of her story is true or embellished by the smoke of memory, her name became a symbol. Hart County remains the only county in Georgia named for a woman, a testament to her legend and the power of resistance that transcends gender and battlefield rank. Georgia's war was also a civil war. Loyalists and patriots fought not just against armies, but against neighbors. Families were divided, communities torn apart. In Augusta and the surrounding region, controls seesawed between British and American forces multiple times. In 1780, Augusta was under British control. By 1781, it had changed hands yet again. Siege warfare, house-to-house combat, and backwoods raids turned Georgia's countryside into a brutal, chaotic theater of violence. And all the while, the enslaved population watched and waited. For them, the promises of freedom offered by both sides were tangled in contradiction. The British declared that any enslaved man who escaped and joined their forces would be granted liberty. Thousands fled plantations, some making it to freedom, others dying in pursuit of a dream that seemed always just out of reach. Some enslaved people were forced into labor for the Patriot militias. Others were taken by British forces and sold again in the Caribbean. Liberty was a word shouted by men with muskets, but its echo often failed to reach those in chains. In 1779, an ambitious attempt to retake Savannah unfolded. The Franco-American siege, led by Count d'Estaing and General Benjamin Lincoln, was one of the most coordinated operations in the South. French warships filled the harbor, and American troops surrounded the city. For weeks, cannon fire rained down on British fortifications. Then, in a bold move, the Allies launched a direct assault. But the British held. Hundreds of French and American soldiers died on the fields outside Savannah. Among them was Count Casimir Pulaski, a Polish nobleman and Revolutionary War hero, who was fatally wounded leading a cavalry charge. His death became a martyr's tale, his name now etched into Georgia's geography, remembered in Pulaski County and in the hearts of Polish Americans who recall his sacrifice. The failed siege was a bitter blow. Savannah would remain in British hands until the war's end. But the Patriots had not fought in vain. Their persistence kept British forces tied down, unable to fully advance into South Carolina or crush the rebellion in the interior. Georgia's role became one of stubborn endurance. In the swamps and fields, in whispered meetings and open ambushes, the revolution continued. It was a war of attrition, of supply lines cut and bridges burned, of rumors and reprisals. It was a war fought by teenagers and old men, women and slaves, and men who wore no uniform but swore allegiance to the idea of independence. And slowly, the tide turned. In 1781, after Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the British grip began to weaken across the South. By 1782, the last British troops withdrew from Savannah. Governor Wright fled for the final time. Georgia, battered but unbroken, emerged from the war with scars that would take generations to heal, and with a new identity forged in fire. It was not the same colony that had hesitated to join the fight. It had become a state, part of a new nation, its place in the Union sealed by the blood of its rebels and the ashes of its towns. Georgia's revolution had been bitter, divisive, and often more personal than political. But in its stubborn resistance, its fierce militia leaders, and its unwillingness to surrender, Georgia had proved something not just to the British, but to itself. This was no longer just a backwater colony with divided loyalties. It was now a part of something larger. It had tasted occupation and triumphed through chaos. And though its post-war years would be filled with tension, rebuilding, and the unresolved contradictions of liberty and slavery, Georgia had made its choice. It had stood with the rebels. Chapter 4: Cotton, Slavery, and the Rise of the Southern Aristocracy. The guns of the Revolution had barely cooled when Georgia began to change. The ragtag militia fighters returned home to scorched earth and broken farms. But hope stirred in their hearts. The war was over, the British gone, and the future belonged to those willing to shape it. In the early years of the Republic, Georgia was a land of enormous promise. Fertile, warm, underpopulated, and open to expansion. It would not take long before this promise turned into empire, and that empire would be built on the backs of the enslaved. At the end of the 18th century, Georgia's economy was still recovering, its politics fractious, and its interior largely unsettled. Yet one thing was becoming clear to those with vision and land. Cotton was king in the making. The plant had been grown in small quantities for decades, but it was the invention of a simple machine that would ignite an agricultural revolution. In 1793, just over the border in South Carolina, a young man named Eli Whitney constructed a device that could separate the sticky green seeds from short staple cotton fibers, a task that had previously taken a skilled laborer all day to clean a single pound. With Whitney's cotton gin, that same laborer could clean 50 pounds a day. Georgia would never be the same. The cotton gin did not create wealth, it unlocked it. Suddenly, lands that had been considered poor for tobacco or rice were perfect for cotton cultivation. From the Piedmont Hills to the coastal plains, cotton fields exploded in every direction. Towns like Macon, Columbus, and Milledgeville began as outposts and became centers of commerce. Savannah's port boomed as bales of white gold flowed downriver and onto ships bound for Liverpool, Boston, and New York. But this prosperity was not shared. The cotton boom demanded more than fertile land. It demanded labor. Relentless, cheap, permanent labor. The plantation elite did not turn to free laborers or sharecropping or innovation. They turned, with full force and without apology, to slavery. Georgia's enslaved population exploded. In 1790, there were fewer than 30,000 enslaved people in the state. By 1860, that number had risen to over 460,000. These were not statistics. They were human beings, men, women, and children, torn from families, chained, bought, and sold like livestock in markets across the South. The same hands that tilled the red earth, planted the cotton seed, and picked the delicate fibers under blistering sun were denied the most basic rights of human dignity. Plantation owners cloaked themselves in a code of refinement. Gentlemen who read Roman philosophy, dined in parlors with fine china, and quoted Jefferson even as they whipped men for speaking out of turn. They built Greek revival mansions with wide porches and columns that seemed to touch the sky. But beneath those whitewashed facades lay violence, control, and the constant fear of rebellion. The Southern aristocracy was not born in castles, but in cotton fields. And the cost of its elegance was measured in lashes and blood. The world of the plantation was a world of hierarchy. At the top were the planters, the cotton kings, who owned dozens, sometimes hundreds, of enslaved workers. Beneath them were yeoman farmers, many of whom owned no slaves but aspired to. Then came the overseers, hired men who managed the day-to-day brutality of forced labor. And finally, at the bottom, were the enslaved, workers in the fields, the kitchens, the stables, and the workshops. They rose before dawn, worked until after sunset, and faced punishment for any perceived shortcoming. Families were often separated, children were sold, hope was a secret, spoken softly in prayer and preserved in songs sung by moonlight. And yet, even in chains, resistance lived. Enslaved people forged networks of kinship, preserved languages and customs, and passed down stories of Africa, of freedom, of God's justice. Some ran into the swamps, to the mountains, across the border to Florida, where Seminole tribes sometimes offered shelter. Others resisted by working slowly, by feigning illness, by preserving their inner selves in a world determined to erase them. Georgia's fields bore not just cotton, they bore silent defiance. As the state's economy grew fat on cotton, its politics bent toward preservation of the system that made it all possible. Slavery was not just accepted, it was defended with a zeal that bordered on the fanatical. Ministers preached that it was ordained by God. Politicians argued that the South's prosperity was proof of its righteousness. Newspapers demonized abolitionists and painted any critique as an existential threat. In Georgia, slavery was not an unfortunate necessity. It was the foundation of everything. And yet the system was not as stable as it appeared. Cracks formed early and widened with each passing decade. Slave uprisings in the Caribbean and rumors of revolts in neighboring states created constant anxiety. White Georgians passed increasingly harsh laws to control the enslaved population, banning literacy, restricting movement, criminalizing even the suggestion of rebellion. Every act of brutality was a symptom of fear. Meanwhile, the Creek and Cherokee nations, still residing on lands desired by cotton planters, became obstacles to expansion. Treaties were made, then broken. Bribes were offered, then rescinded. And when diplomacy failed, force followed. The federal government, under pressure from Georgia and other southern states, would soon implement a policy of removal. But that chapter, dark and haunting, lay just ahead. For now, the Cotton Kingdom reigned supreme. By the 1830s, Georgia had transformed itself into an agricultural powerhouse. Railroads were laid to carry cotton faster to port. Banks emerged to fund plantation expansion. Insurance companies developed to protect the value of enslaved people as property. Every institution, public and private, bent to the needs of the slave economy. Yet beneath the grandeur of white columns and polite society, a different Georgia existed. A Georgia of screams in the night, of broken families, of fields littered with the echoes of songs meant to comfort the suffering and remind them that somewhere, somehow, freedom was real. The Southern aristocracy wrote its own mythology. They called themselves protectors of civilization, stewards of the land, guardians of a noble way of life. They spoke of honor and hospitality, of chivalry and virtue. But the truth was simpler and darker. They had built a world of wealth on a system of bondage. Even the poorest white farmers, who owned no slaves, were caught in the gravitational pull of the system. They supported slavery not because they profited directly, but because the social order it created placed them above someone else. Race became a weapon, used by the elite to divide and conquer, to prevent unity among the oppressed. This was Georgia's paradox, a land of booming wealth and festering injustice, a state rising in prominence even as it sank morally beneath the weight of its own hypocrisy. And still, cotton kept coming. Bales stacked high in river ports, slave auctions echoing through town squares, steamships laden with southern riches gliding silently toward distant ports. The South was becoming a world unto itself, and Georgia was at its heart, a kingdom of cotton, cloaked in gentility, built on chains. By the eve of the Civil War, Georgia was among the richest and most powerful Southern states. It had cast off its revolutionary reluctance and become a proud defender of slavery, of states' rights, of a way of life that saw no contradiction between freedom and bondage. At least, not for those who controlled the narrative. But time was running out. A storm was coming, and the cotton fields would soon become battlegrounds. The wealth, the elegance, the white-pillared dreams, they would all be tested in fire. And yet for now, in this chapter of its history, Georgia stood draped in cotton, crowned in wealth, and haunted by the very foundation that made it all possible. Chapter 5. Trail of Tears. The cotton had brought prosperity, and the plantations had grown fat and wide, sprawling like white-tipped scars across Georgia's interior. But the hunger for land was never satisfied. Beneath the polite drawl of Southern gentlemen and the rattling chains of enslaved workers lay a rising cry from the planters and politicians alike. More land, more soil, more space for the empire of cotton. And between that dream and its fulfillment stood the Cherokee Nation. By the early 1800s, the Cherokee people were not strangers to the white settlers who pressed against their borders. They had adapted, resisted, negotiated, and survived wave after wave of encroachment. They were not nomadic wanderers or faceless tribes. They were farmers, legislators, teachers, warriors, and Christians. They had built schools, printed newspapers, and drafted a constitution. Their capital, New Esota, had courthouses and council houses, and its streets echoed not with the past, but with a people determined to secure their place in the future. Yet for many Georgians, the existence of the Cherokee Nation within the state's borders was intolerable. No matter how civilized the Cherokee became, no matter how many treaties they signed or schools they opened, their very presence on fertile land was an affront to white ambition. The discovery of gold in Cherokee territory near Dahlonega in 1828 only inflamed the desire. Greed, like a spark in dry brush, spread quickly. What had once been diplomatic pressure soon turned into open hostility. Georgia passed a series of laws to undermine Cherokee sovereignty. These laws outlawed the Cherokee government, invalidated their laws, and divided their land into parcels to be distributed to white settlers through lotteries. Non-native missionaries and allies who resisted this pressure were jailed. It was a quiet war, fought not with bullets, but with paper and ink, with laws designed to erase a nation without firing a shot. But the Cherokee fought back, not with weapons, but with law. In 1831, the case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia reached the Supreme Court. The tribe argued it was a sovereign nation and deserved federal protection. Chief Justice John Marshall disagreed, not because the Cherokee lacked merit, but because he believed the court lacked jurisdiction. It was a bitter setback, but not the end. 1 year later, another case arrived. Worcester versus Georgia. This time, the plaintiff was a white missionary, Samuel Worcester, who had been arrested for refusing to comply with Georgia's new laws. Worcester and his fellow missionaries had lived among the Cherokee, taught their children, and stood with them against removal. Their arrest was meant to send a message. Instead, it brought the fight back to Washington. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Worcester. Chief Justice Marshall declared that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community, occupying its own territory, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. It was a monumental decision, a recognition of Cherokee sovereignty and a direct rebuke to Georgia's actions. But paper victories are only as strong as the will to enforce them. President Andrew Jackson, a man shaped by frontier battles and personal disdain for native nations, reportedly responded to the ruling with chilling indifference. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Whether or not Jackson actually said those words, his actions made his position clear. The law, in his eyes, bent to the will of the executive, and his will was removal. That same year, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, giving the president authority to negotiate with native tribes for their relocation west of the Mississippi. Officially, it was framed as a peaceful exchange, a voluntary migration for mutual benefit. In truth, it was legalized dispossession. The Cherokee resisted with every means at their disposal. They sent delegations to Washington, published editorials in the Cherokee Phoenix, and pleaded their case before Congress and the American people. Their leader, Principal Chief John Ross, traveled north to seek allies, gathering over 15,000 signatures on a petition against removal, a staggering number given the population. It was the first mass petition campaign by Native Americans in U.S. history. But Ross's efforts were undercut by division within the Cherokee ranks. A small faction, led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and a few others, came to believe that resistance was hopeless. Fearing total annihilation, they signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. It was a decision that would cost them their lives. The treaty was signed without the consent of the Cherokee government and ratified by the U.S. Senate by a single vote. The removal, now sanctified by treaty, proceeded with brutal speed. In 1838, U.S. soldiers and Georgia militia arrived in Cherokee territory with orders to round up the remaining inhabitants. Thousands were herded into makeshift forts, stripped of their belongings, and held under miserable conditions. From there began one of the most tragic journeys in American history, the Trail of Tears. Over the next several months, nearly 16,000 Cherokee were forced to march over 1,000 miles to the west. The journey spanned rivers and mountains, through rain and snow, with little food, inadequate clothing, and no mercy. Disease spread quickly: measles, dysentery, whooping cough. The elderly died first, then the children. Entire families were buried in unmarked graves along the roadside. Mothers carried infants who would never see their first birthday. Fathers watched sons collapse in the mud, unable to save them. By the time they reached Indian Territory, over 4,000 Cherokee were dead, nearly 1 in 4. The survivors were scarred, their nation shattered, their homeland taken. The Cherokee would never again return to Georgia in numbers, though their memory would cling to the hills, rivers, and valleys where they once lived. Back in Georgia, the land was quickly claimed. The abandoned homes of the Cherokee were auctioned off to white settlers. The fertile fields once worked by Cherokee hands were now planted with cotton. Gold rush towns sprang up and then faded, and the people who had lived there for centuries were reduced in the white imagination to ghosts, curiosities or legends. The men who signed the Treaty of New Echota met grim fates. In 1839, all three, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, were assassinated by Cherokee men loyal to Chief Ross. Their blood was payment for what many saw as betrayal. But the tragedy was not theirs alone. The whole Cherokee nation had paid, and dearly. Georgia, once the heart of Creek and Cherokee culture, now prided itself on being cleared for progress. The railroads came. The plantations expanded. Cotton grew where clans once gathered. The state's leaders boasted of civilization's march, blind or indifferent to the cost. The Trail of Tears was not just a march. It was a wound, a slow, aching wound that never fully healed. It was a test of American law, and the law failed. It was a test of American morality, and morality buckled beneath the weight of ambition. It was a chapter written not just in Georgia's history, but in the soul of the nation. And it would not be the last time that removal, conquest, and racial supremacy would be cloaked in legality and political necessity. Georgia had chosen its path, growth at any cost. But the ghosts of the Cherokee did not vanish. Their names live on in the rivers, in the ridges, in the winds that whisper through the pines. They live on in the memory of injustice and in the stories passed down by their descendants, who remember not just the suffering, but the strength. For the Trail of Tears was not the end. It was a crime, but also a testament to endurance, to survival, to a people who refused to vanish, even when their homeland was taken, their treaties broken, their laws ignored. The Cherokee lived on, and so did the truth of what happened in Georgia, when ambition and cruelty marched hand in hand, and history was written not in ink, but in footprints, tears, and silence. Chapter 6. Secession, Sherman, and Civil War. The fires of war had not yet been lit, but in Georgia, the sparks were already dancing. The years leading to 1861 were filled with rumblings, a tremor in the soil, a tension in the air. The Cotton Empire had brought wealth, but also arrogance. And behind the polished words of Southern politicians lay a deep, growing fear that the world, as they knew it, built on cotton, hierarchy, and slavery, was under threat. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 sent that fear into overdrive. In northern cities, his name was tied to union and moderation. In Georgia, it was heard as a death knell. Though Lincoln had not campaigned on abolition, the planter class saw him as a symbol of change, of northern interference, and of a future where they would no longer hold absolute power over the people they claimed as property. Secession swept through the state like a fever. County meetings turned into rallies. Legislatures passed resolutions dripping with talk of liberty, honor, and rights. Though those rights were reserved only for white men. On January 19, 1861, Georgia officially severed its ties with the United States of America, joining the Confederate States. The vote was not unanimous. Unionist sentiment held firm in the mountainous North and among some poorer whites who feared the wrath of war. But the tide was too strong. The decision had been made, and it would cost Georgia dearly. At first, war was far away. Young men in Savannah, Augusta, and Atlanta donned gray uniforms with excitement, marching off to songs and speeches, chasing a vision of glory. They believed in the righteousness of their cause. They believed the war would be short. They were wrong on both counts. The war crept into Georgia slowly, first as rumors, then as telegrams listing the dead. Georgia troops fought in Virginia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. They died at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. And then the war came home. In September 1863, The hills of North Georgia erupted in violence. The Battle of Chickamauga became one of the bloodiest confrontations of the entire war. Union and Confederate forces collided near the dense woods and shallow creeks outside Chattanooga. For 2 days, the trees echoed with cannon fire and the screams of wounded men. Confederate General Braxton Bragg claimed victory, but it was hollow. Nearly 35,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The blood soaked into Georgia's soil, staining it forever. For civilians, the war became a daily burden. Rail lines were clogged with wounded. Bread grew scarce. Confederate currency became worthless. Enslaved people watched the chaos with cautious hope. Whispers of Lincoln, of freedom, of Union armies drawing near. These whispers traveled faster than any army. For them, the war was not about secession. It was about a chance to live. By 1864, that chance arrived in the form of a man named William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was no stranger to Georgia. He had lived in the South, taught at a military academy in Louisiana, and knew the Southern mind well. But the man who now commanded the Union's Western armies was determined to break the Confederacy, not just by defeating its soldiers, but by crushing its will to fight. Atlanta was his target. The city was more than just a rail hub. It was a symbol, a manufacturing center, a vital artery pumping life into the Confederate cause. In May 1864, Sherman launched his Atlanta campaign. Over the course of 4 months, he battled his way south from Chattanooga, pushing back Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston. It was a slow, grinding advance, inch by inch, hill by hill. Johnston was cautious, always retreating before being enveloped. His strategy infuriated Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who replaced him with the fiery John Bell Hood. Hood attacked recklessly, spilling more Southern blood in failed assaults outside the city. But the die had been cast. On September 2nd, 1864, Sherman entered Atlanta. The city surrendered. Confederate forces fled. The war had turned. Sherman did not stay long. After evacuating civilians, he ordered Atlanta burned. Not completely, as myth would later claim, but thoroughly enough. Munitions depots, factories, rail yards, all reduced to ash. The city's heart was gutted, its future uncertain. For those who watched their homes go up in flames, there was no romance in war, only grief. And still, Sherman was not finished. In November 1864, he began his infamous March to the Sea. With 60,000 troops divided into 2 wings, Sherman carved a 300-mile path from Atlanta to Savannah. The march was not just military, it was psychological. His men lived off the land, foraging food, destroying rail lines, and burning plantations. The goal was to make Georgia howl, and howl it did. The march devastated infrastructure, but also Southern confidence. Slaves flocked to the Union columns, sometimes slowing the army, sometimes aiding it. Many were given work, food, and in some cases, protection. Others were left behind, victims of war's brutal indifference. But for many enslaved Georgians, Sherman's march was a moving beacon of hope, a chance to seize freedom even amid chaos. Plantation owners could do little but watch. Their fields burned, their barns emptied, their power evaporated. For years they had ruled their world like kings. Now they were refugees in their own state. Sherman reached Savannah in December. But here, he did something unexpected. He spared the city. Unlike Atlanta, Savannah was not torched. Its beauty, its architecture, and its port were preserved. On December 22nd, 1864, Sherman sent a telegram to President Lincoln. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." It was not just a military victory. It was a political one. The Union had split the Confederacy in two, destroyed its industrial core, and shaken its very foundations. Georgia, once the jewel of the South, lay broken. In April 1865, the war ended. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered in Virginia. President Lincoln was assassinated. The nation, torn and grieving, began the long road to Reconstruction. But Georgia's wounds were deeper than most. Over 100,000 Georgians had served in the Confederate Army. Nearly 20,000 were dead. Thousands more returned maimed, blind, or broken. Cities like Atlanta had to be rebuilt from nothing. Farms had no laborers. Railroads were twisted heaps. Banks were gone. And perhaps most painful of all to the white elite, slavery was dead. The enslaved people who had built Georgia's wealth were now free, at least legally. But freedom brought uncertainty. Many stayed on the same plantations, now as sharecroppers. Others fled to cities or tried to reunite with families torn apart by decades of forced separation. The promises of emancipation were grand. The reality was fraught, contested, and incomplete. Georgia's Civil War experience was not just military. It was personal. It lived in letters sent home from Chickamauga, in the ashes of Atlanta's warehouses, in the silence of a plantation at dawn with no one left to work the fields. It lived in the eyes of a newly freed mother searching for her son, in the shame of a former slaveholder stripped of his empire, in the rubble, in the songs, in the unmarked graves scattered across the state. The war had changed everything. The Union had held, but the South had shattered. And Georgia, once so proud, so defiant, now faced the consequences of its choice. Secession had seemed like a noble stand. In the end, it had brought ruin. Yet from that ruin, something new would rise. Not just cities, but ideas. Questions of race, freedom, and justice would no longer be whispered. They would be shouted. The fight was not over. It had merely changed form. Georgia, scarred and humbled, would carry its Civil War legacy forward, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror, forcing every generation to confront what was lost, what was taken, and what it truly means to be free. Chapter 7. Reconstruction and Resistance. When the cannons fell silent and the last Confederate flags were lowered, Georgia found itself not only defeated, but unmoored. The war had shattered its fields, its cities, and its pride. Atlanta was a skeleton of rail lines and chimneys. Savannah stood eerily untouched, but its economy had collapsed. Across the state, homes were in ruins, banks had failed, and entire generations of men were either buried or broken. But the deepest rupture of all was not physical. It was moral. The old order, the Southern world built on slavery, had died. And in the vacuum it left behind, the state of Georgia faced a choice: to become something better, or to claw its way back to what once was. The first months after the surrender were marked by confusion. Freedmen, formerly enslaved men, women, and children, walked the roads with no destination but freedom. Some searched for lost family, some sought land or work, others simply moved, as if motion itself proved their liberty. They were no longer slaves, but in Georgia, few were willing to call them equals. The legal foundation of slavery had been swept away by the 13th Amendment. The social foundation, however, remained thick as Georgia clay. The federal government sent troops to maintain order and ensure that emancipation was enforced. The Freedmen's Bureau arrived to provide food, settle labor contracts, and open schools. For the first time in the state's history, black children sat at desks and traced their names onto chalkboards. Churches emerged as pillars of the freed communities. They were more than places of worship. They were schools, courts, meeting halls, and sanctuaries from a hostile world. But the promise of freedom met fierce resistance. Georgia's white elite, humiliated by defeat and enraged by emancipation, looked for ways to rebuild their power. They could no longer own people, so they turned to sharecropping. Under this system, freedmen worked the land in exchange for a portion of the crops. On paper, it looked like opportunity. In reality, it was a trap. With no land of their own, no capital, and no legal protection, most black families quickly became indebted to their former masters. Crop liens, inflated prices at plantation stores, and deceitful bookkeeping kept them bound to the soil. It was slavery by another name. In 1865, Georgia held a constitutional convention under the watchful eye of the federal government. The state repealed its ordinance of secession and officially abolished slavery. But it did not grant civil rights to the newly freed. Black testimony was not allowed in court. Black votes were not counted, and black men were not recognized as full citizens. The white establishment accepted the Union's terms just enough to be readmitted, but they had no intention of reshaping the racial order. When Congress realized this, it responded with what would become known as radical Reconstruction. In 1867, Georgia, like other former Confederate states, was placed under military rule. The state was required to draft a new constitution that guaranteed equal rights and allowed black men to vote. Federal troops oversaw voter registration. For the first time in Georgia's history, freedmen stood in line alongside poor white farmers and cast ballots. The results were historic. In 1868, Georgia's electorate sent black representatives to the state legislature, among them Henry McNeill Turner, a fiery orator and minister who believed deeply in the spiritual and political destiny of his people. Turner and 32 other black legislators took their seats in the Georgia General Assembly, becoming the first such body in American history to include significant black representation. But their triumph was short-lived. Within months, the white majority expelled all black lawmakers, declaring that the state constitution did not explicitly allow them to hold office. It was a blatant act of defiance. The message was clear. You may vote, but you shall not rule. Violence followed politics. Across Georgia, the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, robed and masked men who rode at night, burning crosses in homes, lynching black men, whipping white Republicans, and terrorizing entire communities. The Klan was not some rogue element. It was a coordinated campaign to undo Reconstruction by fear. Federal troops returned. The expelled black legislators were reinstated by force. Georgia ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing citizenship and voting rights regardless of race. In 1870, Georgia was finally readmitted to the Union, the last of the former Confederate states to do so. But reunification was not reconciliation. The 1870s saw a slow and methodical unraveling of Reconstruction's gains. White Democrats, calling themselves redeemers, used violence, intimidation, and fraud to retake control of the legislature. They appealed to white solidarity, to the memory of the Confederacy, and to fears of black power. Their campaign worked. Bit by bit, they chipped away at the fragile framework of equality. By the end of the decade, federal troops withdrew. Reconstruction was declared over. The North turned its attention elsewhere. Georgia was left to govern itself. And what followed was a reimposition of white supremacy, this time clothed in legality and bureaucracy. The black codes evolved into Jim Crow laws. Voting rights were stripped through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Public facilities were segregated. Schools, railcars, and restrooms were divided, separate but equal in theory, but never in practice. Lynching became a tool of terror. Between 1880 and 1930, Georgia recorded one of the highest numbers of lynchings in the South. Justice rarely arrived. The message was sent again and again. You are free, but not equal. You may live here, but this land is not yours. And yet, in the face of this backlash, Black Georgians did not vanish. They built. They organized. They founded colleges like Atlanta University and Morehouse. They formed mutual aid societies, opened businesses, published newspapers, and raised children who learned to read in spite of crumbling schoolhouses. Henry McNeil Turner, now a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, became a leading voice for dignity and self-determination. God is a Negro, he once declared, not in blasphemy, but in defiance, challenging white theology that had long equated divinity with whiteness. Turner called for emigration to Africa, believing that America would never truly accept black people as equals. Others stayed, choosing to fight on American soil. Meanwhile, poor white farmers who had once allied with freedmen during Reconstruction were drawn into a different struggle. The rise of industrial capitalism, the fall in cotton prices, and the dominance of banking elites left many Georgians, black and white, in crushing poverty. The dream of a New South, promoted by politicians and newspaper editors, promised modernization, railroads, and industry. Atlanta rose from the ashes, a phoenix city symbolizing progress. But for many, the promise remained distant. The railroad barons and textile magnates flourished. Sharecroppers starved. Tenant farming became the norm. Families lived at the mercy of landlords and cotton merchants. Children worked the fields instead of attending school. In some counties, illiteracy rivaled that of war-torn nations. And still, the great lie of racial superiority endured, used to divide the poor and protect the powerful. Georgia's path back into the Union was paved with contradiction. It rejoined the nation, but clung to the ideals that had fueled secession. It abolished slavery, but built systems to control the free. It elected black lawmakers, then stripped them of power. It invited Northern capital, then rejected Northern values. And yet, even in this dark chapter, seeds were planted. The fight for equality did not end with Reconstruction. It only changed shape. The descendants of those first black legislators would one day march again. The grandchildren of sharecroppers would sit at lunch counters, ride buses, and stand on courthouse steps demanding justice. The memory of resistance, of fleeting freedom, and of what had been lost would live on. Reconstruction was not a failure. It was a beginning violently interrupted. Georgia had grit. It rebuilt its cities. It restored its economy. It boasted of progress. But it also resisted justice, buried truth, and codified inequality. The state returned to the Union with its flag lowered and its pride bruised. But instead of reckoning with its sins, it doubled down, building a new order that looked eerily like the old. And so, the shadow of war lingered, not in battlefields, but in classrooms. Not in uniforms, but in laws. The Union had been restored, yes, but the soul of Georgia and the soul of the nation was still at war with itself. Chapter 8. The New South and the Old Scars. When the last Union soldiers left and the promises of Reconstruction were rolled up and stored away, Georgia stood at a crossroads. The fields still grew cotton, and the plantation still loomed over the red clay hills. But the world was changing. A new generation of Georgians, white, ambitious, restless, saw themselves not as the sons of rebels, but as the architects of something they called the New South. They dreamed of factories instead of fields, railroads instead of rivers, cities instead of plantations. Atlanta, risen from its Civil War ashes, became the symbol of this new identity. Its phoenix emblem displayed proudly on city seals and public buildings. In speeches and newspapers, Southern leaders promised progress, prosperity, and a break from the agrarian past. But beneath the marble of government buildings and the hum of textile mills, the old scars of the Civil War and slavery still throbbed with life. Georgia was trying to build a future without confronting its past. The New South was, in many ways, a public relations campaign. Men like Henry Grady, editor of the Atlanta Constitution, toured northern cities delivering rousing speeches about reconciliation, industrial growth, and a South that had moved beyond the bitterness of war. He invited investors to visit Atlanta and see for themselves a land no longer defined by rebellion, but by opportunity. He told stories of harmony between white and black, of ex-slaves happily working the land, of racial understanding. But what Grady preached from the podium was far from the truth on the ground. Yes, Georgia was changing. Railroads snaked through pine forests. Cotton was no longer baled by hand, but processed in noisy gins and shipped from booming depot towns. Textile factories rose near rivers, hiring children and immigrants to work 12-hour days. Coal mines opened in the Northwest. A new middle class began to form, small businessmen, managers, clerks. But the wealth remained uneven, and it remained overwhelmingly white. For Black Georgians, the New South looked a lot like the old. They had traded chains for sharecropping, slave quarters for segregated neighborhoods, whippings for lynchings. Jim Crow laws etched racism into every inch of daily life. Schools were separate and unequal. Parks, theaters, streetcars, water fountains, all bore the label of division. The right to vote, briefly granted during Reconstruction, was stripped away through poll taxes, literacy tests, and bureaucratic trickery. Grandfather clauses ensured that white illiterates could vote while black scholars could not. And when laws weren't enough, fear did the rest. Georgia, like much of the South, was gripped by a wave of racial terror. Lynchings were not hidden crimes, they were public spectacles. Notices were passed, crowds gathered. Men, often accused without evidence, were dragged from jails or seized from their homes. They were beaten, tortured, hanged, or burned. Sometimes their bodies were riddled with bullets. Photographs were taken and turned into postcards, and the state looked away. Between 1880 and 1930, Georgia recorded more lynchings than almost any other state. The names of the victims are often lost to history, their only crime the color of their skin, or a glance, or a word, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Black families lived with the constant knowledge that no law would protect them, no court would hear them, and no jury would speak in their favor. And yet, despite the cruelty, Black Georgians built lives. They built schools, like the Atlanta University Center colleges, that became beacons of Black intellectual life. They formed churches that thundered with hope. They opened barbershops, pharmacies, insurance companies. In Macon, Augusta, and Atlanta, they created parallel worlds of dignity in the shadow of a white supremacy. But even dignity could not shield them from hatred. In 1913, Atlanta became the stage for one of the most infamous events in Georgia's history: the lynching of Leo Frank. Frank was a Jewish factory manager from Brooklyn, working in Atlanta at the National Pencil Company. In April of that year, a 13-year-old employee named Mary Fagan was found murdered in the factory basement. Suspicion immediately turned to Frank, though the evidence was circumstantial and contradictory. What followed was less a trial and more a theatrical bloodletting. The press fanned public outrage. Frank's northern roots, his Jewish identity, and his managerial position over Southern workers made him an easy target in a city seething with class tension and racial anxiety. During the trial, mobs gathered outside the courtroom chanting, "Hang the Jew!" Witnesses were bribed, intimidated, or silenced. The courtroom dripped with prejudice. Despite his pleas of innocence and the absence of hard proof, Leo Frank was convicted and sentenced to death. 2 years later, Georgia's governor commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, citing doubts about the case. The backlash was immediate and violent. A group of men, many prominent citizens of Marietta, including a former governor, a judge, and a sheriff, took matters into their own hands. They called themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan. On August 16, 1915, they abducted Frank from prison, drove him to a grove near Marietta, and hanged him from a tree. The lynching of Leo Frank shocked the nation. It revealed the raw nerve of anti-Semitism pulsing beneath the surface of the New South, and it made clear that mobs could still override the rule of law. The incident led to the revival of the Ku Klux Klan on Stone Mountain later that year. Hooded men in robes lit a cross on fire and declared themselves the guardians of white, Protestant, Southern values. The Klan spread like wildfire, through Georgia, through the South, and across the country. And still, the machine of progress kept humming. By the early 20th century, Atlanta had become a bustling metropolis. Skyscrapers, small by today's standards but towering then, pierced the skyline. Coca-Cola, born in a pharmacy on Peachtree Street, was becoming a global brand. Universities expanded. Electric streetcars rattled through neighborhoods. The city hosted the Cotton States, an international exposition in 1895, showcasing the South's economic resurgence. It was at that exposition that Booker T. Washington delivered his famous Atlanta Compromise speech. Before a crowd of white elites, he urged Black Americans to pursue economic self-reliance rather than demand social equality. "Cast down your bucket where you are," he said. It was a speech meant to calm white fears, to offer a path forward. But not all Black leaders agreed. W.A.B. Du Bois, then a young professor in Atlanta, called the compromise cowardice. He demanded full equality, political, civil, and economic. He wrote of a color line that split the nation, and he warned that no amount of economic progress could erase the damage of injustice. Du Bois's voice rose from Atlanta, challenging not only the South, but the entire nation. His ideas would shape the future. But for now in Georgia, power remained in the hands of those who saw progress not as inclusion, but as a way to preserve the old order in new clothes. And yet, contradictions kept stacking. Georgia wanted to be modern, but clung to the past. It celebrated industry, but maintained poverty. It spoke of Christian values, but tolerated terror. It boasted of unity, but silenced dissent. Black Georgians knew the truth. The New South was still haunted. Every railroad spike, every factory wheel, every telephone wire was laid over land soaked in blood. The ghost of slavery still stood behind every courthouse door. The same hands that had once picked cotton now pushed brooms, ran sewing machines, laid bricks, and still waited for justice that never seemed to come. White Georgians, too, were divided. Some sought a future that left hate behind. Others feared losing control. Political battles played out in editorials, elections, and school boards. The past was never past. It lived in statues, in street names, in family stories. And through it all, the land endured. The rivers still flowed. The red clay still dusted wagon wheels and factory boots. The pine forests still whispered. Georgia was changing, but it was changing in layers. Some new, some old, some hopeful, some violent. As the 20th century dawned, the scars of the Old South remained visible. But they no longer defined the state entirely. Something else was stirring. Slow, uncertain, but real. A generation of children, black and white, were growing up in a world their parents could not fully control. The old code still held, but cracks were forming. The New South had risen, yes, but it rose with blood on its hands and shadows at its feet. Chapter 9. Martin, Marches, and the Movement. By the middle of the 20th century, the promises of the New South had faded into disillusion. Factories had risen, cities had grown, but the old foundations of racial inequality remained intact. Georgia was a state of sharp contrasts. Skyscrapers towered over segregated neighborhoods, universities flourished while black children learned in crumbling classrooms, and white politicians preached moderation even as the laws they upheld enforced oppression. But change was coming, not through politicians or industrialists, but through the voices and footsteps of ordinary people. And in the very heart of this rising storm stood Georgia itself. Atlanta had always been a city of symbolism, reborn from the ashes of the Civil War, hailed as the capital of the New South, and now, quietly, it was preparing to become the spiritual capital of a new American reckoning. On January 15th, 1929, a child was born on Auburn Avenue into a family steeped in faith and purpose. His name was Michael King, Jr., though it would later be changed to Martin Luther King, Jr., a name that would echo through every corner of the nation. King's upbringing in Atlanta was both sheltered and stark. He was the son and grandson of Baptist preachers, raised in the warm embrace of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and educated in the city's historically black institutions, Morehouse College, Crozer Seminary, and later, Boston University. He knew dignity, he knew intellect, but he also knew the limits placed upon black bodies and black dreams. Atlanta, despite its air of civility, was no safe haven. Jim Crow laws still ruled the streets. Streetcars were segregated, restaurants barred black patrons, hotels closed their doors. The color line, though sometimes dressed in polite language, was enforced with rigid certainty. Yet Atlanta also provided a foundation, a base of thinkers, pastors, teachers, and activists who believed that Georgia's future did not have to mirror its past. The city had become a hub of black excellence, home to Spelman, Morehouse, Clark College, and Morris Brown. These schools didn't just educate students, they trained leaders. The seeds of protest were planted in classrooms, nourished in churches, and whispered in dormitory halls. As the 1950s unfolded, those seeds began to bloom. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott in neighboring Alabama became the spark that ignited the modern civil rights movement. Rosa Parks's refusal to surrender her seat set off a 381-day protest that captured the nation's attention. A young King, only 26, emerged from Montgomery's churches and into the national spotlight. Though the boycott happened across state lines, its power resonated deeply in Georgia. If Montgomery could fight, why not Macon? Why not Atlanta? Georgia's first tremors of civil resistance came not from its pulpits, but from its students. In 1960, a group of Atlanta University students, including Julian Bond, Lonnie King, and Rosalind Pope, penned a manifesto called An Appeal for Human Rights. It was a direct challenge to the state's segregated society, published in newspapers across the state. It called for equality in schools, public spaces, voting rights, and employment. These students weren't simply demanding dignity. They were asserting their citizenship. The sit-ins followed soon after. Inspired by protests in Greensboro, North Carolina, Atlanta students began targeting downtown lunch counters. Dressed in coats and ties, armed only with books and determination, they took their seats in places that refused to serve them. White patrons hurled insults. Waitresses poured coffee on their heads. Police arrested them by the dozen. But the students returned, again and again. Their discipline was radical. Their silence was thunderous. King himself was arrested in October of that year during one of these sit-ins. Though he was not a student, he joined the protest in solidarity. When a judge sentenced him to 4 months of hard labor for a traffic violation that had been previously suspended, outrage exploded. His imprisonment became a national issue. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy called Coretta Scott King to express concern. Days later, King was released. It was a reminder that Georgia's local battles were now national struggles. While Atlanta became a center for organizing, rural Georgia was a different battlefield, one defined by brutality, fear, and endurance. Nowhere was this more evident than in the city of Albany. In 1961, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, turned its attention to Albany, a city in southwest Georgia with deeply entrenched segregation and a stubborn white power structure. Activists came to register voters, desegregate bus terminals, and open dialogue. But they were met with unrelenting resistance. Police Chief Lori Pritchett, a soft-spoken man with sharp legal instincts, knew how to play the media. He arrested demonstrators with care, instructed officers to avoid violence in public view, and made sure the jails never overflowed. When King himself came to Albany, Pritchett arrested him and released him quietly, robbing the movement of dramatic confrontation. The Albany movement became a painful lesson in strategy. It failed to achieve its full goals, but provided a crucible for future action. It taught the movement how to adapt, how to recalibrate. Still, it also revealed the depth of Georgia's resistance to change. In Albany, freedom songs filled the air while courtrooms emptied hope. But the people endured. They kept marching, kept organizing, kept demanding. The tension was everywhere. In Savannah, protesters picketed white-only department stores and faced down attack dogs. In Macon, church leaders debated whether to join the movement or remain silent. In rural counties, the mere act of attempting to register to vote could get a man killed. But despite the risks, the momentum grew. And always, behind the scenes, and sometimes at the forefront, stood the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded by King and headquartered in Atlanta. From its offices on Auburn Avenue, strategy sessions were held, marches were planned, lawsuits were coordinated. The moral direction of America was being drawn from the very streets where Martin had once played as a boy. Atlanta called itself the city too busy to hate, a phrase coined to attract Northern investment and suggest progress. And in many ways, Atlanta did manage a level of relative peace. Its white leadership, led by Mayor William Hartsfield and later Ivan Allen Jr., worked quietly with black leaders to integrate public spaces without open violence. Schools were desegregated with minimal headlines. Business leaders sought compromise rather than confrontation. But even this progress was conditional, limited to the elite and carefully managed. The poverty remained. The inequality persisted. Suburban sprawl reinforced racial lines. And outside of Atlanta's city limits, Georgia was still very much the Old South. By the mid-1960s, national laws began to catch up to the movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public places. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down the barriers to black suffrage. But laws did not erase prejudice, nor did they stop the backlash. In Georgia, as elsewhere, the gains of the civil rights movement triggered waves of white resentment. The Ku Klux Klan re-emerged in pockets. White citizens' councils met in private. Confederate flags appeared on courthouses and belt buckles, suddenly framed as heritage. Black students were taunted in newly integrated schools. Black workers were passed over for promotion. Racism did not die. It adapted. And yet, the change was real. Black Georgians were now voting, running for office, owning businesses, demanding better schools. Their children were walking through doors their parents had only dreamed of. A new generation of leaders was rising. Men and women who had marched, been jailed, been beaten, and still believed in America. Martin Luther King Jr. continued to lead, traveling from Atlanta to Selma to Washington to Memphis. He expanded his message, from civil rights to economic justice, from Southern laws to global peace. He spoke against the Vietnam War. He planned a poor people's campaign. He challenged not just Southern racism, but American greed. And then, in April 1968, he was gone. Shot on a balcony in Memphis. Carried home in sorrow, mourned by a nation, buried in the city that had birthed him. Atlanta stopped that week. The funeral was attended by presidents and paupers. The procession moved through silent streets. Thousands stood in the Georgia sun and wept. And in that moment, the whole world saw what Georgia had given and what it had lost. But Martin's legacy did not end there. His church, Ebenezer Baptist, became a shrine. His words became scripture. His city, still scarred by division, became the center of remembrance and renewal. In time, Atlanta would elect a black mayor, build a national park around King's birthplace, and become a symbol, imperfect but powerful, of the struggle's endurance. The civil rights movement in Georgia was not a clean arc. It was jagged, painful, and often filled with contradiction. It was led by students and preachers, mothers and janitors, lawyers and sharecroppers. It was fought in jails and courtrooms, on sidewalks and in schoolyards, in whispers and in shouts. It was resisted by laws, mobs, indifference, and fear. But it moved, slowly, sometimes invisibly, but always forward. And in that movement, Georgia became more than the site of injustice. It became part of the redemption story, a place where the moral compass of a nation was recalibrated. a place where a preacher's son took the words of an ancient gospel and bent them toward a new reality. In the heart of the South, in the red clay where cotton once grew and chains once rattled, a movement marched. And in its footsteps, history followed. Chapter 10. Peaches and Power. Georgia's soil had once been soaked in war, burdened by bondage, and cracked under the weight of segregation. But by the late 20th century, something unexpected had happened. The state that once defined the Old South was now beginning to redefine the new one. Change, long resisted, had finally begun to take root, not just in its laws, but in its economy, its skyline, and its identity. The red clay was still there, and the peaches still sweet. But power had shifted. Georgia was no longer simply a place where history happened. It was becoming a place where history was made. Atlanta stood at the center of it all. Long before it became the symbol of Southern resurgence, Atlanta had been a city of ambition. Built on railroad lines and rebuilt from Civil War ashes, it had always looked forward. But it was in the 20th century that it began to rise, not just as a Southern capital, but as a global city. In office towers and corporate boardrooms, Atlanta was crafting a new identity. Modern, connected, and unafraid to lead. Nothing symbolized this transformation more clearly than Coca-Cola. Born in 1886 as a medicinal tonic sold in a downtown pharmacy, the fizzy brown drink became a cultural phenomenon. By the mid-20th century, Coca-Cola was no longer just a beverage. It was a brand, an image, an empire. Its headquarters in Atlanta became a beacon of the city's economic cloud. From Times Square to Tokyo, the white script on a red background told the world something unmistakable. This company and this city had reach. But Coca-Cola was only the beginning. Delta Airlines, Southern Bell, CNN, Home Depot, all called Georgia home. The city's skyline filled with glass and steel. The highways roared with commerce. Suburbs expanded outward, swallowing farmland and forests. Atlanta had become what boosters had long promised, the economic engine of the South. Hartsfield-Jackson Airport emerged as the most vivid symbol of that momentum. It began humbly, but over time it grew into the busiest airport in the world, not just in flights, but in influence. Millions of passengers passed through its gates each year, connecting Georgia to every continent. Atlanta was no longer a regional hub. It was an international crossroads. And yet, amid this economic rise, Georgia's rural soul still pulsed. The fields in the South still grew peanuts and pecans. The peach orchards in the middle of the state still bloomed. Small towns still gathered around Friday night football games, courthouse steps, and Baptist sermons. But even in the countryside, modernity had arrived, just more slowly. Paved roads replaced red clay trails. Cable television brought distant voices into farmhouses. And in many of those homes, families kept their eyes on a man who had once been one of their own. Jimmy Carter was born in the tiny town of Plains in 1924, the son of a farmer and nurse. He grew up in the rural heart of Georgia, a place of simple routines, deep faith, and racial segregation. His boyhood chores were the same as those of any Southern farm kid, working in the fields, tending livestock, attending church. But Carter's world was different in one key way. He noticed things. He saw poverty, he saw injustice, and he remembered them. After graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy and serving in the Navy, Carter returned to Plains to run the family peanut business. But politics soon called. He ran for state senate, then for governor. In 1970, he won the Georgia governorship by campaigning as a moderate in a time of Southern backlash. But his inaugural address surprised the state and the country when he declared, "The time for racial discrimination is over." It was more than a speech. It was a signal. Georgia, for so long a bastion of white resistance, now had a governor who had grown up in segregation and was willing to leave it behind. Carter's time in office focused on education, efficiency, and human rights. His demeanor, soft-spoken, moral, rooted in faith, set him apart from the bombast of the political world. In 1976, Carter launched an improbable campaign for president. Few believed a peanut farmer from Georgia could unseat the political elite. But the nation, still reeling from Watergate and disillusioned with Washington, was looking for honesty. Carter offered just that. "I'll never lie to you," he said. It was a promise that resonated. He won. And with that victory, Georgia sent one of its own to the highest office in the land. It was a defining moment, not just for Carter, but for the state. Suddenly, Georgia was on the map in a new way. Plains became a pilgrimage site. Tourists lined up at the family peanut farm. The Southern drawl, once mocked in Washington, now echoed in the Oval Office. Carter's presidency was marked by highs and lows. Middle East peace negotiations, energy crises, inflation, the Iran hostage situation. His tenure was not perfect, and he would lose re-election to Ronald Reagan in 1980. But his post-presidency became a second act, unlike any other. Through the Carter Center, he championed global health, democracy, and peace. He built homes with Habitat for Humanity well into his 90s. His example became a reminder that character outlasts politics. Back in Georgia, the 1980s and 1990s continued the trend of transformation. The civil rights movement had cracked the old order, but real change took time. Black political power in Georgia slowly expanded. In 1973, Atlanta elected its first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, a grandson of John Wesley Dobbs, the mayor of Sweet Auburn, and a longtime civil rights activist. Jackson's election was historic, but it was also practical. Atlanta's population was majority black, and the city's power structure was finally beginning to reflect its people. Jackson expanded Atlanta's airport, diversified city contracts, and laid the groundwork for the city's future. His leadership made Atlanta a place where black business, black politics, and black culture could flourish. His successors, Andrew Young, Bill Campbell, Shirley Franklin, continued that legacy. Atlanta was no longer too busy to hate. It was now building a future in which inclusion was not a threat, but an asset. The cultural influence of Georgia also began to grow in ways few could have predicted. Atlanta's music scene exploded, first with R&B and soul, later with hip-hop. Artists like Outkast, Ludacris, T.I., and Usher turned the city into the capital of Southern sound. Studios opened, film crews arrived. Georgia's tax incentives for movies turned it into Hollywood of the South. Marvel superheroes and zombie apocalypses were filmed just down the street from historic churches and barbecue joints. But not all of Georgia's modern story was about triumph. The state still wrestled with inequality, rural poverty, political division, and the legacy of race. Confederate flags flew from pickup trucks and front porches. Debates over monuments and memory flared across city councils and courthouse lawns. In some corners, the past still whispered too loudly. Yet even in that tension, Georgia proved its complexity. It was not one place, it was many. It was Atlanta and Albany. It was Savannah and Rome. It was the Civil War and civil rights. It was peanuts and power, peaches and protest. And as the 21st century approached, Georgia had become something few had imagined just decades earlier: a bellwether. The state's population surged. Immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa made Georgia their home. Suburbs diversified. Political loyalties shifted. A new generation, raised on the internet, shaped by globalization and unwilling to accept the lies of the past, began to vote, speak, and lead. The journey from cotton to Coca-Cola, from plantations to the presidency, from segregation to Stone Mountain protests, was long and painful. But Georgia had walked it, step by step. It had stumbled, resisted, regressed, but it had also grown. It had produced thinkers, fighters, builders, and dreamers. In the modern age, Georgia was no longer just a state in the South. It was a force. Its airport connected continents. Its cities birthed revolutions. Its past warned. Its future promised. And its people, diverse, defiant, determined, kept writing the story. A story not yet finished. Chapter 11. The Political Awakening. By the 1990s, Atlanta was no longer just the unofficial capital of the South. It had become a rising player on the world stage. Its skyline shimmered with ambition. Its airport moved more passengers than any other on Earth. And its culture, driven by music, business, and a complex racial history, was beginning to echo far beyond the Georgia state line. But it was a single moment in 1996 that crystallized what Atlanta had become and what Georgia was on the cusp of being. The Olympics. When the International Olympic Committee awarded the 1996 Summer Games to Atlanta, more than a few eyebrows were raised. Competing against cities like Athens, Toronto, and Melbourne, Atlanta was the underdog, young, sprawling, without the ancient ruins or romantic backstory of its rivals. But Atlanta had something else: logistics, infrastructure, corporate backing, and a story of rebirth. A city that had risen from the Civil War's ashes now promised to host the world. And it delivered. The Games were a spectacle. Centennial Olympic Park was built in the heart of the city, connecting venues and revitalizing downtown. Events were held across Georgia, from Savannah's graceful waterfront to the rolling hills of Gainesville. Millions of tourists flooded the state. Billions watched on television. Atlanta was suddenly not just a southern city, it was a global one. But the triumph was not without shadows. On July 27th, a bomb exploded in Centennial Olympic Park, killing 1 and injuring over 100. The attack, later blamed on a domestic terrorist, shook the celebratory mood. The city mourned, but carried on. It was, in some ways, symbolic of Georgia itself, a place of progress that still carried pain. After the Games, Atlanta grew even faster. New businesses arrived. The airport expanded again. Suburbs boomed. The city became a magnet for young professionals, immigrants, and creatives. And with that growth came demographic change. Steady, significant, and transformative. By the early 2000s, Georgia's political map still looked comfortably red. The Republican Party had taken control of the governor's mansion in 2002 for the first time since Reconstruction. Rural counties stayed conservative. Evangelical churches fueled turnout. But beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. The cities, especially Metro Atlanta, were becoming younger, more diverse, and more democratic. African American voters, long the backbone of the Democratic base, were being joined by Latinos, Asian Americans, and a new wave of white progressives. These communities weren't just moving into Georgia. They were being born there. They were starting families, running businesses, voting. One of the most consequential figures to emerge from this moment was a woman from Gulfport, Mississippi, who had moved to Georgia for college and never left. Stacey Abrams, a graduate of Spelman College, Yale Law School, and a former tax attorney. Abrams was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 2006. By 2011, she was the House Minority Leader, the first black woman to lead either party in Georgia's legislature. But Abrams wasn't just a lawmaker. She was a strategist, a coalition builder, and a visionary. She understood something that many had missed. Georgia was not a red state. It was a voter-suppressed state. If you registered people, protected their rights, and got them to the polls, the electoral map could change. And so she started working, not in headlines, but in neighborhoods. Her organization, New Georgia Project, registered hundreds of thousands of voters, especially in communities long ignored. In 2018, she ran for governor against Republican Brian Kemp, who at the time also served as Secretary of State, the official in charge of overseeing elections. The campaign was fiercely contested. Abrams built a massive grassroots movement, turning out new voters and challenging old assumptions about what Georgia politics could be. Kemp narrowly won, but the election was mired in controversy. Purged voter rolls, closed polling places, long lines in black neighborhoods. Abrams did not concede in the traditional sense. Instead, she launched Fair Fight, an organization focused on voting rights and election integrity. The loss became a catalyst. Abrams turned disappointment into infrastructure. Then came 2020. The presidential election that year was unlike any in modern history, marked by a pandemic, mail-in ballots, political polarization, and a sitting president who refused to commit to accepting the results. Georgia, for the first time in decades, was in play. And then, Georgia turned blue. By fewer than 12,000 votes, Joe Biden won Georgia, the first Democratic presidential candidate to do so since Bill Clinton in 1992. The moment was seismic. It was not a fluke. It was the result of years of organizing, especially among black voters, youth, and suburban residents disillusioned by extremism. The Georgia suburbs, once Republican strongholds, were shifting. But the story didn't end in November. Because of Georgia's unique system, both of its U.S. Senate seats were up for grabs in January 2021, in runoff elections that would determine control of the Senate. The stakes could not have been higher. On one side were Republicans David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, both wealthy incumbents closely aligned with Donald Trump. On the other side stood two very different candidates. Jon Ossoff, a 33-year-old Jewish documentary filmmaker, and Raphael Warnock, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, the same pulpit once occupied by Martin Luther King Jr. Their campaigns were groundbreaking. Ossoff would become the youngest senator elected in 4 decades, and Georgia's first Jewish senator. Warnock would become the state's first black senator. Together, their wins flipped the Senate. But the night before the results were certified, something darker unfolded. On January 6, 2021, while Georgia was finalizing its election count, a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., attempting to overturn the election. Fueled by lies about voter fraud, many centered on Georgia, the insurrection marked one of the darkest days in American democracy. Georgia, once on the margins of national politics, was now its focal point. The backlash came quickly. In March 2021, Georgia's legislature passed a sweeping new voting law, SB 202, signed in private by Governor Kemp under a painting of a plantation. The law added ID requirements for absentee ballots, restricted drop boxes, and made it a crime to hand out water to voters waiting in line. Critics called it voter suppression. Supporters said it was about integrity. The battle lines were drawn again. Major companies like Coca-Cola and Delta, once cautious about politics, came under pressure to speak out. Some did, others hesitated. Activists called for boycotts. Celebrities weighed in. The phrase Jim Crow 2.0 began to circulate. Through it all, Georgia remained divided, but energized. Voter engagement surged. Debates played out not just in courtrooms, but on front porches, in barbershops, on college campuses. A new generation of activists, many inspired by Stacey Abrams and Warnock's victory, began organizing year-round, not just for elections, but for justice. By the time the 2022 midterms rolled around, the state once again took center stage. Raphael Warnock faced off against Herschel Walker, a former football star turned Trump-endorsed candidate. The race was ugly, expensive, and nationalized. In the end, Warnock won again, this time outright. Georgia had not just flipped once, it had held the line, and John Ossoff, still serving his first term, had become a national figure, championing ethics reform, voting rights, and youth engagement. Together, he and Warnock represented something that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. Two Democratic senators from Georgia, one black, one Jewish, both elected on progressive platforms. But Georgia's transformation was not just political, it was generational. The children of immigrants, the descendants of sharecroppers, the college students raised on hip-hop and social media, all had come of age in a state that no longer fit a single narrative. And yet, the past was never far away. Statues of Confederate generals still stood in public squares. Voter suppression lawsuits clogged the courts. Gerrymandering shaped who had power and who didn't. The Confederate battle flag, though removed from official places, still flew on private property. The state's wounds, while healing in some places, remained open in others. But the awakening had happened. Georgia was no longer predictable. It was no longer peripheral. It was contested ground. And that, in a democracy, is not a flaw. It is a sign of life. From the peach farms of South Georgia to the tech startups of Midtown Atlanta, from the pulpit of Ebenezer to the podium of the U.S. Senate, Georgia had evolved. The 1996 Olympics showed the world what it could build. The elections of 2020 and 2021 showed the world what it could change. Power, in Georgia, no longer flowed in a single direction. It pulsed, it shifted, it was claimed, challenged, reimagined. It belonged to the people now, black, white, brown, young, old, rural, urban. And as the state looked ahead, to more elections, more change, more reckonings, it did so with a new sense of self. No longer just the heart of the South, but the soul of the American experiment. Chapter 12. Legends, Landscapes, and Legacy. Georgia's story has been one of battlefields and ballots, of marches and movements. But beneath the headlines and history books lies something deeper, something quieter, but just as vital. Georgia is not just a place where events happened. It is a living, breathing soul wrapped in red clay, sweet tea in the slow roll of time. To understand Georgia's legacy, you must look beyond the statistics and into the stories songs, and landscapes that continue to shape its people. Start with a sound, a familiar voice, smooth as molasses and filled with memory. When Ray Charles sang Georgia on My Mind, he wasn't just performing a song, he was conjuring a feeling. His voice wrapped itself around the syllables of the state's name, transforming it into a hymn, a longing, a prayer. Born in Albany, Georgia, Charles would go on to become one of America's most influential musicians, breaking barriers in genre, race, and artistry. But Georgia was always close to his heart. Ironically, the state that inspired his most beloved song had once banned him from performing because of segregation. But decades later, it would make that very song its official state anthem. In Ray Charles, Georgia saw both the pain of its past and the beauty of its promise. His music didn't just entertain, it remembered. It stitched together the South's sorrow and joy, its contradictions and hopes. And just as Georgia gave the world Ray Charles, it gave it Flannery O'Connor, another artist whose work cut through illusion and confronted the truth. O'Connor was born in Savannah and later lived in Milledgeville, a town that had once served as Georgia's antebellum capital. Her stories are strange, violent, and steeped in grace. They speak of grotesque characters and spiritual reckonings, of the haunted inner lives of ordinary Southerners. Her voice was sharp, ironic, and unapologetically Southern. In her fiction, Georgia is not a backdrop. It is a character. Dirt roads, Baptist revivals, family secrets, the unbearable heat. They're all woven into her stories like kudzu wrapping around a porch post. O'Connor understood that to write honestly about Georgia was to write about faith and failure in the same breath. Her legacy is one of literary courage, of telling the truth even when it wasn't pretty. But Georgia's legacy is not only in its artists. It lives in the land itself, in its landscapes that have endured since long before colonies, constitutions, or campaigns. Head south and you'll find the Okefenokee Swamp, a vast and mysterious wilderness straddling the Georgia-Florida line. It's one of the largest intact freshwater ecosystems in North America, filled with cypress knees, alligator eyes, and an eerie silence broken only by birdsong and wind. The name Okefenokee comes from a native word meaning land of the trembling earth, a fitting title for a place that defies human attempts to tame it. To walk through the swamp is to feel time stretch. Here, the past breathes. You can imagine the Seminoles who once sought refuge in its depths, the settlers who feared it, the moonshiners who hid among its shadows. Even now, it resists intrusion. It whispers a truth Georgia has always known. Some things are meant to remain wild. Then there's the north, where the Appalachian foothills roll across the land like sleeping giants. Towns like Dahlonega and Blue Ridge are tucked among the hills, quiet, charming, and steeped in their own kind of history. Dahlonega was the site of America's first major gold rush, years before California's boom. Prospectors once swarmed its rivers, sifting for treasure. Today, the gold remains mostly in Story, but the hills still shine, especially in the fall, when the leaves turn fire red and pumpkin orange, and the air carries the first whisper of winter. In Blue Ridge, the train still runs through the mountains, now filled with tourists instead of timber. The pace is slow on purpose. People sip cider on porches, listen to bluegrass in the park, and hike trails where cell signals vanish, but wonder returns. These towns aren't famous for politics or protests, but they hold something essential, a sense of place, a reminder that Georgia's soul isn't just in Atlanta's skyline or Savannah's squares. It's in the small towns where stories are passed down over biscuits and front steps. And those stories, told in dialects thick with time, form the backbone of Georgia's legacy. Stories of grandmothers who survived Jim Crow and told their grandkids to vote. Stories of veterans who returned from war to fields they no longer recognized. Stories of immigrants who opened corner stores in towns that once turned them away. Stories of teachers who taught freedom between the lines of old textbooks. Stories of kids who believed, despite everything, that this place could be better. Georgia is not perfect. It never has been. But it is honest, brutally so. Its history is written in both triumph and terror, in cotton and chains, in ballots and bullets, in marches and music. It has burned and rebuilt. It has resisted and repented. And through it all, it has endured. It's in the soil, the kind that stains your hands red and refuses to let go. It's in the magnolia trees and pecan groves, in the lazy bends of the Chattahoochee River and the salt air of Tybee Island. It's in the barbecue pit and the church pew, in the thunder of a high school football game and the quiet of a sunrise over Sapelo Island. Georgia is not one thing. It is many. It is the home of Martin Luther King Jr. and the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. It is Stone Mountain and Sweet Auburn. It is the Civil War's last gasp and the Civil Rights Movement's first breath. It is both the plantation house and the protest march. It is blues and gospel. It is Coca-Cola and cotton fields. It is a red state turned purple, a battleground and a birthplace. Its contradictions are not weaknesses. They are the proof of growth. Georgia does not run from its past. It wrestles with it. Every generation has to reckon again with what it means to be from here, to live here, to claim this place as their own. Today, Georgia stands at the crossroads once more. Its cities are booming. Its culture is global. Its politics are unpredictable. Its people are diverse and dynamic, and they are watching closely, watching to see if this time the promise of Georgia will match its potential. Because Georgia's greatest legacy may not be in what it has been, but in what it is becoming. It is becoming a place where difference is not feared, but embraced. Where truth is told, even when it hurts. Where songs are sung not to forget the past, but to make peace with it. Where stories aren't just remembered, they're still being written. The final chapter of Georgia is not the end. It's the turning of a page. And somewhere, across the hills or in the cities, by the swamp or the sea, someone is humming that familiar melody. That one song that feels like home. Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through. Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind.